So, I mean, and maybe just to get maybe to the contents of the book, because I'm sure the listeners and viewers would like to obviously know a bit more about the book. I mean, I know that there's a second edition that's on its way. I'm not sure if it's out yet, and I'm not sure how different it will be from the current copy that Simo and I have read. But I presume, as I've heard you speaking on previous interviews, that it'll have about two more chapters. I'm not sure if I've got that accurately, but I'll give you a chance to maybe just say a bit more about the book. Obviously, not revealing too much, but yeah, just to give us a sense of what it is that we can expect from the book. So I mentioned before I introduced you, Prof, that I had a conversation with Prof. Duplessis in which we discussed the history of money. And I thought it would be important for us to discuss more broadly the history of economics. And that's why I actually thought it was important to have this discussion with you. And of course, when I have some of these discussions, I've had a lot of debates and discussions with friends that have gone on well into about economics and about history more generally. And it's my realization that there is a view that has been allowed to develop and perhaps even to coagulate in the mainstream. And it is that it is only those of us who have pro-market inclinations that have any explanations to give. And I mean, as far as I can tell, if history and economic history more specifically is anything to go by, I mean, we should be the ones demanding explanations from those that demand them from us. So, I mean, when we talk about economic history, I think there's a lot of optimism that, we can derive from it. And of course, that's, a contention nowadays. But I mean, I don't want to be too long-winded. I just wanted to talk very quickly about, obviously, the point that I've just made now about, the contention that those of us who espouse pro-market ideas and the kind of backlash that we get. So, and I think you actually hint at this and you actually try to deal with it in the book. And one clue that you give in the title of the book is with the words economic freedom. And we, of course, know in South Africa that the terms economic freedom are not so much associated with the kind of economic freedom that those of us who espouse these pro-market ideas have come or have become acquainted with. So why that title? Hey, I thought it was a very interesting title. I think the choice of the words was quite interesting. So do you maybe wish to talk a bit more about why those particular words and whether you mean what the guys with the red berets mean by economic freedom?
Yeah, well, there are many questions in that question. So let me start with the final one first, and then you can kind of pull me back on the road again if I get distracted. I think actually we do mean the same thing when the EFF. Obviously, I can't speak for them, but my suspicion is that we share the same vision about what we want, and that is that people have economic freedom. And what do I mean with that is the ability to produce what you want, so work where you want to work, have a job that is a fulfilling job. Firstly, have a job. I think that's obviously within the South African context important, but also one that is fulfilling, that you grow up to be whatever you want to be. And I think we're certainly not there yet. And secondly, then consume what you want, right? So there are very high levels of poverty still in South Africa, and so clearly there are a lot of people that would want to consume, better housing, better, more nutritious food, all of these things that they want, leisure, that they can't consume, right? So there's, in a very, very kind of basic sense, economic freedom is the ability to consume and produce what you want. Right? And of course, I must say, historically, for most South Africans, that has not been the case, right? There were rules and regulations that prevented where people can live, what type of jobs they can fill, what type of education they can have. And so it is certainly South Africa is one where these freedoms were restricted, where they inhibited. So I think that's the ultimate goal. The question is how we get there, right? And I think that's where we differ probably from, or at least where my view would differ from EFF, for example, view, right? So I think they would attach a much greater role for the state to be involved. And I think you alluded to the fact that I think if we study economic history, you understand the role, the incredibly powerful role that the market can play in creating prosperity, right? So I think ultimately the market, it's not to say that there should only be a market, there should be no government. Of course, there should be a government. There's many things where the market failed, but I think the majority or the dominant role should be that of kind of the market approach. And the reason I say that is because we've tried many different approaches in history, right? So you can study history and you know that there are basically three ways of solving, the economic problems of production and distribution. So that's really what economic freedom is about. How do we produce enough things, the right things, and how do we distribute it fairly and equitably? And we've tried, the tradition approach, for example, so that is typically, you do basically the same things that your parents did, and you just continue that system. It's in a sense, it's a very simple system, but it doesn't really lead to any innovation. Right? Or you can have this kind of state command type approach, which is like there's a government or a command council, right? In South Africa, we know this term but well, that dictates what should be produced. Now that sounds, in a way, it sounds quite an appealing thing to do, because now there's some dynamism in the system. You can build a pyramid, or you can build, something big and infrastructure, all of this, and that's great. But the problem there is that people lose freedom, so they don't have individual choice anymore. Like, you have to do what the state tells you to do. And the third one is basically the Adam Smith kind of approach of just let people do whatever they want. Now that seems crazy, right? To just let people do, but ultimately it's about people reacting to the price mechanism. So prices dictate, right? All our collective decisions are captured in the price of things. And of course, that means that we should try and have a competitive system. So we should have many buyers, we should have many sellers, because then ultimately the price is an efficient and equitable way of distributing things. But if you have a monopoly, for example, then typically they set monopoly prices, and so that creates inefficiencies in the system. So again, that's perhaps where the government can intervene to help this market system become more efficient and more equitable. But ultimately, it's still the market that makes these decisions. So I think that's really the lessons from history, and how we can, or at least my view of it, is how the types of policies that we set going forward can get us to a more economically free society. I think just in terms of the title, I think, yeah, of course, it alludes to Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. There's a reason for that, in that the book is about global economic history, but it's written from a South African or African perspective. And so I really want to make that point already in the title, right? So that, and I think as soon as you see the title, you already know that this is from a South African perspective. So that's great. But I do think the most important word actually in the title is the hour, right? So most people kind of forget actually the hour when they kind of talk about the book, but it's so essential, because ultimately economic history is about cooperation, right? The idea that we are in this market together is an idea that we have trust between one another. You spoke to Professor Duplessis about money. Money is a construct that relies entirely on trust, right? There wouldn't be any money if there is no trust. I think Harari, this historian from Jerusalem, who wrote *Sapiens*, makes that point very, very clearly, that it's all about trust. And trust requires inevitably, cooperation, and they are, and so I think that's the fundamental thing about that we need to understand going forward, is that as soon as these relationships between people in South Africa break down and we lose the trust in one another, that also has economic implications, right? There's other implications obviously as well, but it means that we have to start becoming more independent. But as soon as we become more independent, we become poorer, right? So hunter-gatherer societies, for example, are incredibly independent, right? They can survive on their own for millions of years, but they're also poor. The richest societies in the world are incredibly interdependent. They specialize in this one narrow thing, and they buy all their services, their housing, their clothing, their food, everything from other people. And so that's really the kind of society we want to live in, but that relies on trust. It means that if I go to a shop and I should be able to offer them my money, and they should accept that money, and I would be able to purchase it. That's an incredibly, it's such an incredible innovation, and we kind of forget it. We think we take it for granted, but as soon as societies break down, this trust in war or whatever breaks down, you very quickly realize that is really what underpins our prosperity. So I'm not sure if I've answered all the questions in there. Perhaps just the final thing, when you started out, you mentioned something about the new book. So let me just say that the book was published, the first one was published in 2021 by Tafelberg in South Africa. So that's the South African edition. There's a new international edition coming out actually as we speak. It's being delivered at my home, so it's now in print, and it's slightly a longer version. It's about 10,000 words more. There's a new chapter on war actually, which was quite fortuitous, because I wrote this already last year before the Russia-Ukrainian war, and hopefully this will also be published next year in South Africa. So a revised version will be published, the second edition. But I think they are, I think the one that you said and reviewed is, in my mind, that's 95% of what is in the book is the main message.